Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's Medical Center Hour. Let me first let people in the back know, and latecomers know, that there is overflow seating in G1 and G2, and I believe a couple of the other rooms in the conference center here. So I would encourage you to find a seat in one of those rooms. I would also ask that no one sit on the steps in this room because we don't want to cause a health crisis for the fire marshal who has issues with that. So welcome to this Medical Center Hour, which doubles as the 2019 Bice Memorial Lecture. Medical Center Hour proudly partners with the School of Nursing to celebrate the return to UVA of one of the most important figures in American religion and spirituality today, someone who was also especially a distinctive, distinguished, and deeply respected change agent in the care of the dying. This person is Roshi Joan Halifax. In this Bice lecture, we'll learn about her newest work, which focuses on some of the most intensive ways in which we connect with our fellow human beings, opportunities for courage and compassion that play out daily, sometimes hourly, for persons in the helping and healthcare professions. It's my great pleasure to recognize Dory Fontaine, Dean and Sadie Heath-Cabanis Professor of Nursing, who will introduce Roshi Joan Halifax to you. Working with Dory on many shared programs over 11 years has been a total delight. Like Roshi Joan Halifax, Dory is a change agent of the first order. She's been a signal leader, having helped UVA navigate some choppy waters and contentious moments during her tenure as the nursing dean. And she's deftly guided her school into new frontiers, such as the Compassionate Care Initiative and interprofessional education. Today marks Dory's and my final formal collaboration on a Medical Center Hour, for Dory retires after this academic year. It's my hope and my expectation, however, that her fresh spirit, her grace, her generosity, and her openness will continue to enliven the School of Nursing and inspire all of us. And before Dory comes up, let me quickly say that Roshi Joan Halifax declared no conflicts of interest involving healthcare goods and services. Thank you. Welcome, Dory.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Marcia told me right before I was coming up here that she was going to say something about me, and I said, no fair. I was going to say something about you. You know, Marcia has run Medical Center Hour for 23 years, and I think we should honor her, you know, for sure. You know, it was my delight when I got here to kind of nose around and find out about Marcia. And then we started, you know, collaborating, and the rest is history. I'm really going to miss it, but I think I'll come back for many of these programs. So I'm very honored to have the privilege of introducing our speaker today, someone whose work and life have had an enormous personal and professional impact on me and many of my friends and colleagues, and actually they're all here, which is pretty amazing. Before I get to that, however, I would like to just share a bit about the woman whose name graces this lecture, the school's beloved former nursing dean, Zuleme Baber Bice. Dean Bice was a Navy nurse during World War II, and she led the school between 1961 and 62, and again from 64 to 66. The love of her life, Professor Ray Bice, who was an amazing professor here, he endowed a lectureship in her name when she passed away from breast cancer many years ago. So each year it gives us a great platform to bring in some thought leaders to speak about issues that really matter to nursing, medicine, our interprofessional colleagues, caregiving, and beyond. Sort of like, you know, Bed, Bath, and Beyond. We're in the Beyond section. We're in the Beyond section today. So today's speaker falls into many of those categories. So I first met Roshi Joan when taking part in the Being with Dying program back in 2009. That is why we're celebrating 10 years. Shortly after arriving at UVA as the dean, Mrs. Maria Tusiklugi funded 15 UVA physicians and nurses and others to attend this 8-day program. I kept saying, I can't go, you know, I'm a new dean, you just can't leave. We all went, mostly as strangers, although working in the same health system, and after a life-changing week for me and others, we came back as devoted friends and colleagues. And thus began the Compassionate Care Initiative, now celebrating, as of April, 10 years, our 10-year anniversary. It's pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. We've raised funds to send small groups of interprofessional colleagues every year for 10 years, and it's the best thing that we do. Our mission in the CCI is to reduce human suffering by creating compassionate people and systems. So there are many superlatives for Roshi Joan, but I'd like to share with you how she describes herself in this wonderful book that we are going to be celebrating today, too. She says, life has taken me into geographically, emotionally, and socially complex geographies, organizing within the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 60s, working in a big county hospital as a medical anthropologist, founding and leading 2 practice and educational communities, sitting at the bedsides of dying people, volunteering in a maximum security prison, collaborating with neuroscientists and social psychologists on compassion-based projects, and running health clinics in the remotest areas of the Himalayas today. These experiences, she says, have given her a unique perspective on the value of taking in the entire landscape, leading to her characterization of the edge states as keys to a compassionate and courageous life. She believes in the inherent compassion in each of us, not something that we are just born with while others are not. And she believes compassion isn't a force that drains us. She says it enlivens us mentally and physically, boosting our immune system. So for all of us that have had colds for 2 months, you know, this is where you're supposed to be today. You know. So on a more personal note, having taken part in that Being with Dying program at the start of my deanship, it feels fitting that Roshi Joan Halifax is here and present today as I close out my last few months as dean. You know, there's something full circle about this today. So without further delay, I give you Roshi Joan Halifax. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful.
It's an honor to return to UPA, and I was saying to Dory that actually I went to church school just over the mountain ridge at Stanton, in Stanton, Virginia, Stewart Hall. And so I have this kind of, you know, it's just a little bit like returning home. I'm always, you know, I look at those years at Stewart Hall with affection and ambivalence. So, hi, John. I'd love you, if you have been to Upaya, if you would raise your hand. Wow, well, it's great to have you in the audience. Hey, Michael. And I want to acknowledge Tusiklugi for really watering the seeds of this work at UVA, but also I refer to UVA, it's kind of my poster child. 70 people from the School of Nursing and School of Medicine have been through the training at Upaya, the clinician training for Upaya. And you are truly the change agents. Yeah, it's very moving. And I often cite that number when people say, well, I'm the only one in my healthcare system. I said, well, UVA has done something extraordinary, but really it's at the feet of Dory Fontaine and her courage and commitment, and Tusiklugi, who began this initiative. And I just am extraordinarily grateful for this the privilege of working with clinicians from your community. I also want to acknowledge Susan Bauer-Wu, who is president of the Mind and Life Institute. And that is an institute that is working on the interface between contemplative views and practices and neuroscience, social psychology, and also social change. And we're old friends. And Susan has been to Nepal with me, and I just like to give her a hand. And following on that acknowledgement, Francisco Varela, who was my close friend for 2 decades, is a neuroscientist and philosopher. And in an unusual way, he kind of set me into this path of discovery. And so I want to bring his name into our community here. So the last person I want to acknowledge is my grandmother. My grandmother lived on Abercorn Street in Savannah, Georgia. And Savannah was a fairly big town, but she was a kind of village woman. She actually had come from Faulkner country, from the southern part of South Carolina, and married and moved to Savannah. And she was a very independent, very, very powerful Southern woman. In fact, when I knew her as a child, she had long white hair, so long she could stand on it. Those were those years. And as a young woman, I heard that her hair was kind of copper-colored. And I can't imagine how beautiful she was as a young person. And she had a very unusual role in her community, but not completely unusual, which she introduced me to when I was a child, when my family would go to Savannah. And it wasn't a big house, and Aunt Agnes, who was a hoarder, lived on the top floor. So my mom and dad and my sister and I were, sort of scattered around. But I always stayed in Aunt Bessie's room in her bed. I called her Aunt Bessie. And she would go about stuff in the day, and then, we'd crawl in the hot Savannah summers into this bed, a little like the bed I'm sleeping in now, which is almost a danger to humanity. In other words, you sort of have to leap into the bed to get in. I'm staying in the Colonnade Club in the Jefferson room, and it's like, oh, okay. Grabbing the covers and stepping on the sideboard, and up I go. And I slept 10 hours last night, so something good is in that bed. I only had to get up once, and I did manage not to injure myself. But in any case, and Bessie had one of those beds, and we were in that bed together for quite a few summers. And she would talk about what she had done during the day. She was the person in her neighborhood who was called upon to not only sit with dying people, but also upon the death of anyone, she would pick out their clothes that they would be, buried in or put in for the funeral. And for the women, she would dress their hair. Can you imagine, dress their hair? You can see where I'm from the South, even though I sort of sanitized my accent. But nonetheless, what was fascinating for me in retrospect was, one, she normalized mortality. I think that's also something in Nepal that I'm very sensitive to. The difficulties that we encounter in this work in Nepal, which suddenly has grown to be very robust, is when Western clinicians recognize that the village people where we're serving, they have normalized mortality. But we haven't, for the most part. So this was something that was quite striking for me in retrospect. As a child, I didn't think about it. But when looking back on these interactions, very intimate with my grandmother, to recognize the gift that she gave me. And the second piece that I think is really important is that she actualized a kind of compassion which was not so related to what we know as sympathy and not so related to what we understand as empathy. She had a set of qualities in her presence that, in retrospect, when I began to explore issues related to how do we actualize compassion in a culture where being compassionate is actually, in some contexts, looked on or deemed to be unprofessional. And also where compassion has often been conflated with empathy and confused with sympathy. And so she had a set of qualities which were really remarkable. And it was, in retrospect, I mean, many years after her death, that I began to look at this issue of what is compassion. But the third piece is also important. She suffered a stroke, and then she had colon cancer. And finally, my father realized he really couldn't take care of his mother and put her in a nursing home. And I remember standing with my father as we were visiting my grandmother with very garbled speech, begging my father to hasten her death. And it was very shocking for me as a young person. First, the sense of futility that at this point in our society, we really didn't have either the resources or the perspective on how to care for dying people. And that the helplessness that my family felt in relation to the warehousing of my grandmother, which caused a lot of guilt in my family. And upon her death and looking at her in her coffin, I think some of you know I made this vow to explore what it means to care for dying people and to see if I could make some small contribution to changing care of the dying in our country. So, Bessie Bandy Halifax, I thank you. I also want to return to the Klugis. Not only did they initiate this great work here at UVA around contemplative care of the dying, but I was made a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress. So I had this unstructured time where I had no responsibility and could sit in the Jefferson Library and explore a series of concerns that I had, really arising out of the Being with Dying training, with so many clinicians coming into the training who felt demoralized. And quite a few of the clinicians wanted to migrate out of medicine and nursing. And I was also very concerned about the fact that actually training people in compassion is not so easy. It's not such an accessible process. And though I believe that compassion is intrinsic to who we really are, that it actually requires a kind of nurturance of that possibility, like watering seeds within our mental continuum, so that compassion can be actualized in a healthy, principled way in our society. And so while I was at the library, I sat with a series of questions. And those questions are questions that helped me with a thought experiment, because I actually didn't know what compassion was either, in the sense of, how do you define this? Oh, yes, it's our capacity to be of benefit to others when suffering is present, but that is so general. And so I asked myself a question, very simple question, which is compassion possible when attentional balance is not present? And I recognized clearly that for compassion to be present, for us to deeply presence the suffering of another, we need to be grounded. We need to have a high resolution of perception. And we also need to be able to sustain our attention, to allocate our attention to another for more than a fragment of a moment. And I saw clearly one of the fundamental features of compassion, which is a non-compassion element, but without which compassion is not possible, is attention. And I looked, of course, into my own experience as a contemplative and as a caregiver, and realized that the most profound interactions where there was a high degree of mutuality were those moments when I was deeply connected and present to the person whom I was endeavoring to serve, and where my attention was not divided, where it was not distracted, and where it was not dispersed. And I recognize also that at this point, our technology, that was, I think, I can't remember how many years ago I was at the library exploring this, maybe 7 or 8, but that our technology was providing a platform where our attention was being colonized by content from our technology. And not only colonized, but actually manipulated in such a way that our capacity to actually to perceive the truth of suffering, the suffering of the person across from us, or our own suffering, was becoming increasingly less accessible. And this was also complicated by another interesting factor, and that is our technology was creating the conditions where we were more and more dissociated from our body. And this little data point was fascinating to me, and it was brought to my attention in a small Mind and Life meeting that happened in Detroit with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and Richie Davidson was there, Amishi Jha, Tanya Singer, Joseph Goldstein, Mathieu Ricard, myself, and a few other social psychologists sitting with His Holiness, looking at what are the questions that are worthy of research around issues related to compassion. And Tanya Singer made an observation that really struck me. And that was her work with people suffering from an autism-related disorder called alexithymia. And that people who suffer from alexithymia have two very distinct, I don't want to say symptoms, but inaccessibilities. And one of those is a lack of capacity to attune into the experience of others, somatically, affectively, or cognitively. But that capacity related to empathy was also duplicated in another capacity which wasn't present, which was the inability to read their own interoceptive processes, to be somatically in touch with what was happening in the body. And she did neural mapping and saw there was a great overlap in our ability to be somatically attuned, to be embodied, to be aware of what was happening in the body, to bring attention to the body, to track or to be able to read our somatic experience. and to our capacity to actually sense into or to expand our subjectivity, to include the somatic or affective or cognitive experience of others. And a light went off in my head. And that light was that clinicians are typically trained in such a way that there's increasingly dissociation from the body, not only through our technology, but when I was at the University of Miami School of Medicine as a young medical anthropologist in the 1970s, just watching what happened to medical residents was just shocking. The disallowing of actually taking care of the body, not actually having time to go to the toilet or to eat, to sleep, and so forth. And I realized the very training of clinicians, one aspect of it, divided clinicians from what was happening in their own physical experience. And this could have a very problematic effect on the capacity to actually increase one's subjectivity to include the experience of another. So that ability to actually attend to what's happening in the body or in our emotional stream or cognitive stream, just the moment, the pause that Jonathan Bartels talks about, the pause that Cinda Rushton talks about and teaches at Hopkins, just a moment so that one can do self-attunement. And without self-attunement, expanding the self to include the experience of another becomes more challenging. So that was another question I asked myself. Is it possible to be compassionate without having this fundamental ability to be, one, grounded, and two, to be pro-social, to actually want to expand your subjectivity to include the experience of another? And I realized, pro-sociality was very important. And I asked myself, is it possible to be compassionate without having some kind of insight? Insight, for example, into the distinction between self and other. Yes, it's very important to be in resonance with others, but over-identification will cause stress and distress. Or that there's such a distinction, heavy distinction made, that objectification of the other causes another set of issues. So insight into the distinction between self and other, but also into the importance of actually expanding our subjectivity to include the experience of others. Now, for those of you who are social psychologists, you're hearing me phrase this a little differently than it's done in the literature. Actually, empathy is often described in a certain way as a kind of out-of-body experience. You're in the shoes of another, the emotional shoes or the physical shoes or the cognitive shoes. But actually, that's not how I believe empathy operates. Empathy operates through the experience of inclusion, not a kind of leaving of the body. So this is one of the important features of how do you create the conditions where our sense of subjectivity is not just so bounded in the small self, but we are actually have the tools, the capacities to increase our sense of subjectivity into including others. So insight is essential in compassion. And then I began to work on this heuristic map of compassion. And it was really fun to do. I was sitting there in the Jefferson Library in my nice little office and just no responsibilities, and began to map out the importance of embodiment, the importance of prosociality, the importance of cultivating stable attention, the importance of insight. And I realized all these are so-called non-compassion features, but compassion was actually a dynamical system that when the suite of features associated with pre-compassion, if you will, where in a certain relationship, the emergent process was compassion. And it was a very interesting insight from a systems perspective. And I went to Berlin and shared this work with Tanya and with other scientists, and then came back from that meeting also with the intention of developing a tool for clinicians but it wasn't just for clinicians, it could be educators or parents or in the human rights work, that would make compassion accessible as we interact with others. And that tool is called Grace. And it's very, it's like something you have in your back pocket. We just finished, Cinda Rushton, Tony back, and I just finished a big training at Upaya of Grace with people actually in the law profession and educators and clinicians and human rights workers, about 80 people. It was very wonderful that we do this every year. And the Grace intervention, so to speak, is very logical. It's a mnemonic, and the G of Grace is gathering your attention, getting grounded. And the R of Grace is recalling your intention. It is developing this capacity of moral sensitivity and also moral nerve. I love that perspective shared by Joan Didion. The balance between strong back and soft front. The A of Grace is attunement, but first to yourself. So that understanding that attuning to our own subjectivity somatically first, seeing what's happening in the body. The body is this huge repository of information, allows us to access often, frequently, our implicit biases and to make adjustments in terms of how we view the person across from us who's suffering. Attunement at the self level to our affective stream, and also cognitively before we actually attune to others. So that's the A of Grace, self-attunement first, being grounded somatically, emotionally, and cognitively, attuned into what's going on in the body, mind, and heart. And then opening ourselves in resonance to others, the A of Grace. Then the C of Grace is considering what will really serve. It's that pause point and looking at things both person to person, but exploring systemically. And then the E of Grace is engage and then end. So that's the sort of short of it. Part of the work, though, brought me to an exploration of human qualities, human processes that are really essential for us to actualize in our interaction with others as we're endeavoring to serve. But often these experiences are difficult for us, cause problems. So I began to develop this exploration of what I came to call edge states. And by edge states, we have this sort of image of being at the high edge of the best of our human selves, but also how easy it is to tip over the edge and find ourselves kind of sliding down the cliff or falling off the cliff into an abyss. And one of the reasons I wanted to look at this was that I myself found my own life had been characterized by experiences that were very fraught, particularly around issues related to altruism and the experience of altruism and of empathy. And then I began to look at the literally hundreds of people that I have sat in interview with and to map out what I feel are the 5 key edge states. I write about this extensively in my book, which can make our work in service to others much more viable, but also can cause great suffering, not only to ourselves, but to others, and also to the institutions that we're serving in and that we're serving. So the first area that I looked at was altruism. I was so moved in how important it is to be altruistic. And my good friend Mathieu Ricard has done this sort of magnificent book on altruism and speaks about altruism. In our practice as Buddhists, we emphasize the importance of selflessness, of altruism, of care for the world, of dedicating whatever good that has risen for us, for example, in the experience of our practice to the welfare of others. His Holiness the Dalai Lama speaks about this in many different ways. And it is an essential social process without which none of us would be alive. You know, at least our mothers kept us going, if you will. But we also have discovered there seems to be altruism in the non-human realm as well. And thank you, Deval, for this evidence. But there are expressions of altruism which are very unwholesome, where we harm ourselves egregiously, mentally, emotionally, physically, economically, socially, spiritually, because of the kind of self-sacrificing attitude that we bring, where perhaps our identities are very much wrapped up in our being good altruists, where we see this, for example, among women. I sure saw it in my mother, where she would go to extremes in serving others, but it would cost her and it cost our family dearly. And because her sense of purpose and social identity and personal identity was deeply invested in being a self-sacrificing altruist. And I want to thank my mother. I learned great lessons from her and some hard lessons from her. The field of pathological altruism is just beginning to open up. And it's an interesting field because, you know, it's a little difficult to say who is really a pathological altruist, if you will. And it sounds kind of bad. And I just want to put a little parenthesis in here. The wonderful thing about the edge states, because we've all gone over one or over one or off of one or another edge, that coming out from these experiences where we have caused harm actually builds character. We don't have to look for those experiences. They'll take us out. Don't worry. But I remember once Archbishop Tutu said of Nelson Mandela, he said, Nelson lacked empathy before he went to prison. And you just think all of the suffering that he went through and ended up being this profound force of goodness in the world. So going over the edge, a bit like breaking a leg, and the bones in the good circumstances knit back stronger. Don't worry if you've gone over the edge. Those experiences build character. So I'd like to cite a kind of example. It's not in healthcare because I don't want to be discouraging, but this is a Afro-American man named Wesley Autry who lived in New York City, had 2 daughters, and was on a subway platform with his daughters one day. There were 100 other people on that subway platform, and a young guy had a seizure and fell into the subway tracks. And Autry, without even a minute, not even a second, leaving his 2 daughters on the subway platform, jumped off the platform into the subway tracks, and on top of this young guy called Holopeter, who was having a seizure, and held him down for a moment, realizing that the subway was heading so quickly toward them, there was no way that he could extract them safely. And the subway passed over his head, sort of nipping his wool cap, and Holopeter and he were not harmed. And then he was deemed this extraordinary hero. So this is just this story you read about it. Thank you, New York Times. In the New York Times, and it's like fascinating. But I asked myself the question, if Wesley Autry had been killed, would he have been deemed a pathological altruist, for example? So, you know, we have to be kind of careful. So much has to do with circumstances and also our view of things. And in a given moment, what could be deemed to be pathologically altruist in another circumstance could be deemed to be healthily altruistic. And we know that entire countries, for example, can be disabled through pathological altruism. We look at Haiti. This is a good example. Also, Nepal, which is a few years ago, I don't know if this is still true, but was indicated to be the second poorest country in Asia. And to see all the NGOs and kind of disempowering people in the name of goodness. So part of the work that I think all of us have to do is not only about cure, but it's also about care. And that care relates not just to person-to-person care, it's also how do we create the conditions in any given system to empower and educate people to care for themselves better and care for each other better. The next edge state that I explored was empathy. And partly it came out of, I don't think this was the trip that you and I were on, Susan. Susan was with me in the Nomads Clinic, but it might have been. We were in a standing clinic in Simikot in Nepal, in the Humla area in the northwest. And a very worn down man carrying this kind of bundle of reeking rags stepped into the clinic. And Gary Pasternak, you were there. Gary Pasternak and some of the Nepali nurses approached the man. I was standing by and unwrapped this bundle, and inside was this little girl who had been horrendously burned. And some of the burns were infected, others were actually doing better because they were infested with maggots. And it was horrible to see the condition of this child. And her father was a deaf mute, and so could not communicate anything. Susan, it's amazing, I forgot that this was the time you were there. So we brought the child and the father with our Nepali nurse team and our clinicians into a little room. And in the course of the situation, we did not have pediatric anesthesia. We carry pediatric anesthesia now. And the Nepali nurses spent an excruciating several hours debriding this child's wounds. It was really horrendous. And the child was very upregulated, as you can imagine. And I was standing behind the clinicians, quotes, holding space. And you know, you're up at 13,000 feet, you know, I'm herding cats, the doors of the clinic are being beaten down. It's this complicated scene to kind of manage. And I was very vulnerable, and I was there in the room, presencing, and I was so identified with the child. that I had this vasovagal response where my blood pressure went up and then it went right into the cellar. I thought I was going to throw up and shit on the spot. And I was just about to pass out. And I had this little moment of insight, which was, that wouldn't be a good thing to do, actually. You know, it was kind of disruptive, and to say the least. And I shifted my attention to the sensation of my feet on the floor. And I intentionally regulated my subjective experience at the somatic level by reallocating my attention to something that was just neutral, but also had a sense of grounding to it. And I stayed for some moments as I could feel my blood pressure beginning to change. And I also had this kind of warmth coming up in my body. And something broke open inside of me, which was this sense of gratitude for the child's father walking for 2 days, carrying this fragile, wounded, precious being. And I felt this kind of overwhelm of gratitude. And then behind that was the next thought, which was this sense of absolute gratitude that we were there and that our team was doing what it was doing. Out of that experience, the grace process developed because I realized that, one, I had lost attentional balance. I had also lost touch with why we were really there. I had also over-identified with the child, gone into a state of empathic distress. And just out of the experience of being an old-time meditation practitioner, somewhere in that complicated field of somatic and affective responses, I had this little moment of insight and was able to actually regulate my situation. And out of that, then the work on compassion and grace emerged. So empathy is the second feature that I look at. And often we conflate empathy and compassion. But and some of the social psychologists do, but in talking with Richie Davidson and Al Kaznak and other colleagues in the field, I've made a very particular distinction between empathy and compassion. Empathy is that experience of resonance with others, somatically, emotionally, cognitively. Compassion can definitely include empathy, can include the experience of resonance, but it also includes the experience of concern, and it also includes the aspiration to actually alleviate suffering, which might not be part of the package of empathy. And I know from inside my own experience that a world without empathy is a world where we're really dead to each other. Empathy is an important process for us as human beings. I think of the time when I fractured my leg, and a nurse, this was in a hospital in Toronto, a nurse came in and adjusted my body, and she wasn't treating it like a piece of meat in a butcher shop, treating me like that. In fact, I could feel that she was in resonance with me, in somatic resonance with me, so that when she adjusted my body, it caused much less pain than would have been had somebody else been there making that adjustment. So that experience of somatic empathy is essential, particularly for people who are in physical contact with others. Also, that experience of affective empathy, of emotional empathy, where we are in resonance, we're presencing each other, and we're in emotional resonance with another. and our ability to do perspective taking or mind reading, to actually have a sense of how other people might see the world as different from the way that we see the world. This is really important in the kind of work that you do as clinicians. It was in the context of another meeting with the Mind and Life group that I met Nancy Eisenberg, who does research around children. And I took an algorithm that she used in relation to understand how empathy operates and retranslated that algorithm in a specific way, understanding that when we are presencing suffering, it is really important to have some arousal level, but that arousal level has to be regulated, either automatically regulated because we have the inner structure to balance ourselves, or from a top-down perspective, intentionally regulated. And without regulation of empathy, where we're over-identified with the suffering of our patients or the suffering of others, empathic over-arousal and distress, and what Daniel Batson has called personal distress, is inevitable. And that personal distress can take two different pathways. One of those pathways where empathy is poorly regulated is related to what is called selfish prosocial behavior. I love these terms in social psychology. But this is behaviors that are actually about taking care of our over-arousal, of our distress. And so a woman is standing before you whose husband is gravely ill, and her grief is overwhelming her and could overwhelm you. And you begin to manage her grief by saying, here, let me get you some Kleenex, instead of just allowing yourself to be there in presence, her grief as it is. So Batson would call that selfish prosocial behavior. There's another pathway, however, and that this pathway relates to the three fear responses of fight, flight, and freeze. And in fight, it is the sense from over-identification with the suffering of others, of moral outrage, where anger and disgust braid together, and we begin to blame and shame the situations or the people who have caused suffering. Or flight is avoidance or actual abandonment of our patients. And I'm remembering a consult that Cinda and I did in the team at Hopkins of the CICU, the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit, where actually these nurses had all of it. They had fight, they were morally outraged. Flight, this was a transplant that was not good, and the cardiac surgeon was completely insistent on pushing for every salvation for his patient at a great cost, including multiple amputations, decubitus ulcers, and misery for the patient. And finally, the patient died. And the nurses felt awful because the patient was suffering so much that they began to actually avoid going into the patient's room. So avoidance and abandonment. And then freeze, the third fear response, is when we just are locked down. We're just completely numb. So the regulation of empathy as an edge state is really important. And also empathy is really essential in our human experience, particularly in caring for others. I also looked at issues related to integrity, how it is to live within our principles and to understand that for me, violations of integrity occur when we harm ourselves or harm others. And I began to look at the profiles of what I call moral suffering, including moral distress, moral injury, moral outrage, and moral apathy. And moral distress is when we can see a pathway through, but we can't actualize it. Moral injury is when we are complicit in causing suffering for others, or we've witnessed others causing suffering to others, and we feel guilt, shame, and blame, and actually injured by violation of our values and integrity. Moral outrage is the shame and blame going outward. And then moral apathy, which is really, I didn't think about it till I went to see I'm Not Your Negro, where James Baldwin nailed it. He just talked about moral apathy in eloquent terms, and I realized moral apathy either through addiction or being ignorant of or choosing to be ignorant of the suffering in communities and others or this earth, we could deem moral apathy. So integrity. And then respect became the fourth edge state, which includes horizontal hostility. And this was actually brought to me, my attention, by the nurse, Jan Janner, who was part of our chaplaincy training, who did her thesis on bullying between nurses. And some 15 to 20% of nurses actually leave the nursing profession because of the disrespect they have been subjected to by their peers. And I became really interested in this because I'm 76, so I was part of the feminist great movement in the 70s, and I saw similar behaviors among feminists in the 1970s and realized horizontal hostility is actually rampant in our culture. And vertical violence is an expression of disrespect where we see our politicians exercising vertical violence, but also people who feel disempowered, whether it's a student, a child, people of color, people who are economically deprived, from kind of bottom-up perspective, disparaging those who have authority and responsibility. And the fifth edge state that I looked at was related to engagement. That it's so important that the work that we do of service in the world have meaning for us, and that we also work in healthy environments. And we're doing work that actually nurtures the best of our humanity. And when those conditions are not present, then burnout is the outcome. But you can read in extensive way all this in the book. I did ask myself the question, however, since we're always on these edges, what is the pivot? What can we actualize to engender balance, allow us to stand on the high edge of any one of these qualities, and to actually take in the whole landscape, both the shadow side and also the side that we associate with our values. And I realized that the pivot was compassion. That our capacity to experience and engender attentional balance was essential in order for us to see clearly our internal conditions and conditioning and the conditions and conditioning around us. That emotional balance was essential, which include also prosociality, engendering not the negative self-talk that is so much a part of what's happening in our little minds today, but really putting our hand on the tiller of our narratives so we can head in a healthy direction. I realized that compassion also was a base for wisdom, deep insight, and that it also involved a commitment to action. And that with these conditions, the edge states, the valences associated with the fraught side of the edge states could be transformed in a direction that was positive. So I'd like to just finish and take a few questions. We're at the hour, but it's words from a wonderful clinician, Rachel Naomi Remen. And she said, helping, fixing, and serving are three different ways that we view life. When we help, we see life as weak. When we fix, we see life as broken. And when we serve, we see life as whole. So I hope that in some small way, my talk has served today. But more than that, your view of what you do in the world as clinicians to end suffering comes from this deep ground of love, of compassion, and then compassionate action embodied in service. So thank you. Thank you.
I don't even know how to say thank you. That was extraordinary.
Oh, thank you.
And we have just a little bit of time for questions. There will also be time for you to engage with Roshi Joan outside. There's a reception. And there also is, the UVA bookstore is here with the book on Edge States. And she will be signing books as well. So we have an opportunity for just a couple of comments and questions. You all may be just sitting here processing everything you've heard. But if somebody is sort of quick to the words, we'll take your question, comment, and
or not.
Yes, or not. Well, why don't we all just sit with our thoughts? We will close formally this hour. I hope you will come next week. We have a program with Dr. Bernie Lowe from the Greenwall Foundation, Fordham University law professor Kimani Paul Emile, a program dealing with racist comments by patients, dilemmas in the hospital and society. And this is our Upaya lecture, and we hope that you will all be here. Again, thank you to Roshi Joan Halifax.
Dory. And I actually want to ask Dory to stand up. I don't need the hand, but she has earned our gratitude.